Hi, this is Gary with Aldan American. Today we're going to show you how to set up coilover shocks from scratch. In setting the rear shocks up, we also are setting up a 4-link rear suspension and a panhard rod. They all go hand in hand along with the front suspension. When we're setting up the rear shocks, we have to also need to know where the ride height on the truck is, which means we also have to determine the front ride height before we get started. The truck already has a 4-link rear suspension in it. This style is considered a parallel 4-link, so you got your upper bar and your lower bar. And so as your axle travels up and down, it will travel on a little bit of an arc because these bars are connected at both ends. Classic trucks typically have leaf springs. Leaf springs have a lot of problems with ride quality because when we're making a hot rod, we're not really carrying a load. So a lot of times, the leaf springs that were designed to carry a half-ton payload is not what we want for our down-low cruiser. Typically on a hot rod, we're trying to get them a lot lower than the car was from the factory with the leaf spring. So by going to a 4-link rear suspension, we could determine where we want the rear axle to sit in relation to ride height, and then we can also put our 4-link suspension. The 4-link suspension is going to give better ride quality, it's going to give better handling, and it's a more modern way of controlling the rear end than a leaf spring. So now that we're talking about the 4-link rear suspension, there's two different basic 4-link suspensions. This is a parallel 4-link where your upper bar and your lower bar are parallel to each other, whereas the second style is a triangulated 4-bar. A triangulated 4-link suspension typically has an upper bar and a lower bar that are opposing each other to keep the rear end centered in the rear suspension. The biggest differences between a triangulated and a parallel 4-bar suspension is on a parallel 4-bar suspension, we need to run a panhard rod or a Watts link to keep the rear axle centered. There's nothing keeping the rear end centered except for a Watts link or a panhard rod. With the triangulated, because of the opposing angles, the rear end stays centered in the chassis. When we're setting the rear axle up, we want to make sure that the axle is centered in the wheel opening of the fender. We also want to make sure that the axle is perfectly square to the chassis, because if the axle is not square to the chassis, the car will dog walk. Instead of going down the road straight like that, it'll do this going down the road. When setting the panhard rod up, what I did here is I welded this little nut and a bolt so that I could set the rear end so that it stayed centered in order to determine my panhard rod length and mounting locations. After we determined that the axle was in the correct location, then we mounted our rear and front brackets. And so in mounting the front and the rear brackets, we want to make sure that they are perfectly in line with the frame rail so that they're square, again, making everything square. And we took our level at ride height and put our level on the upper bar to make sure it was level to the ground. At that point, we tack welded all of our brackets in place. We want to tack weld everything together before welding it solidly because it may change. So now that we've got our 4-link, we've got our panhard rod, we've got our axle, everything's in its correct location. Now what we want to do is determine how we're going to do and install our shocks. This frame had already been C-notched previously, but it did not have a boxing plate on the inside, and we also needed to support our shock mount. So what we've done is we've taken 1/8" steel, we've boxed the inside of the frame for the added support because of the C-notch. We also have added this plate to support the shock mount. I hope you found this video informative and helpful on how to set your 4-bar up, your coilover shocks up. And for any additional questions, you can get a hold of us at aldanamerican.com or you can leave comments right here on the YouTube.